Fire in the wilderness. To find the real George Washington, we must first destroy the statue. We all know the image. It is on the dollar bill in your pocket. It is carved into the cliffs of Mount Rushmore. It is the portrait of an old man with powdered hair, a stern jaw, and eyes that seem to judge us from across the centuries. We call him the father of his country. We think of him as a stoic, emotionless figure, a man made of marble, not flesh. But in the year 1753, George Washington was not a father, he was a son. And he was not made of marble, he was made of fire. Picture him at 21 years old. He was a physical giant for his time, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, towering over his contemporaries. He had hands the size of dinner plates, reddish-brown hair tied back in a queue, and a physicality that commanded a room. But beneath that imposing frame was a young man consumed by a desperate, aching ambition. He was a Virginian, yes, but he was not from the top tier of the aristocracy. He was a second son, with little inheritance and less prospect. He was a man starving for distinction. In the 18th century, there was only one way for a young man of limited means to rise: war. Washington did not dream of an American republic. He dreamed of the British Empire. He idolized the Royal Army. He coveted the red coat of a king's officer. He believed that if he could prove himself in the savage wilderness of the frontier, the empire would embrace him. He would become a gentleman. He would be someone. And so, fueled by vanity and courage in equal measure, he walked into the woods, the frontier of the 1,750 seconds. The Ohio Valley was not a peaceful landscape. It was a powder keg. France and Britain, the two superpowers of the age, were circling each other like wolves, both claiming the vast, dark forests of the American interior. In May of 1754, Washington led a small, ragtag band of colonial, militia, and Native American allies deep into this disputed territory. He was inexperienced. He was anxious. He was looking for a fight. He found one at a place called Jumonville Glen. It was a damp, rocky ravine. Washington and his men crept to the edge of a cliff, looking down on a camp of French soldiers who were just waking up, cooking their breakfast. What happened next is a blur of history and fog. The French would later claim they were on a diplomatic mission. Washington claimed they were spies preparing to attack. He didn't wait to find out. The young Virginian gave the order: fire. The silence of the forest was shattered by a volley of musket fire. It was a massacre. In 15 minutes, 10 Frenchmen were dead, including their commander, Ensign Jumonville. The rest were captured. Washington, in his youthful arrogance, wrote a letter to his brother describing the skirmish. He wrote, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." He had no idea what he had done. He thought he had won a small skirmish. In reality, that volley of shots in a Pennsylvania backwood sparked a chain reaction that would explode into the French and Indian War, and eventually, the 7 Years' War. It was the first true world war fighting that would spread from America to Europe, to India, and the Philippines. A 22-year-old surveyor had just set the world on fire by mistake. Hubris is usually followed by a fall, and Washington's fall was brutal. The French army did not take the death of their commander lightly. They descended on Washington with overwhelming force. He retreated to a makeshift stockade he named Fort Necessity. It was a pathetic defense, a small wooden circle built in a sinkhole that flooded when it rained. Trapped, soaking wet, his men drunk on the camp's rum supply, and surrounded by hundreds of angry French and indigenous warriors, Washington was forced to surrender. It was the only time in his life he would ever surrender. The humiliation was total. The French forced him to sign a document of capitulation. It was written in French, a language Washington did not read. Unknowingly, he signed his name to a confession, admitting that he had assassinated the French diplomat Jumonville. He marched home in disgrace. The British press mocked him. They called him a bungler, a provincial idiot who had started a war he couldn't finish. His dream of a royal commission seemed dead. But history is a forge. It melts men down to remake them. 1 year later, in 1755, the British Empire sent a massive professional army to crush the French. They were led by General Edward Braddock, a man who represented everything Washington wanted to be: disciplined, aristocratic, and confident. Washington volunteered to serve as his aide. They marched toward the French Fort Duquesne. It was a magnificent sight, thousands of redcoats, drums beating, bayonets gleaming, carving a road through the ancient forest. They were the greatest fighting force on earth. They were invincible until they weren't. On July 9th, near the Monongahela River, the trap was sprung. The French and their Native American allies didn't fight in lines like gentlemen. They fought from behind trees, from the shadows, invisible and deadly. The British Army, trained for the open fields of Europe, collapsed into panic. Officers were picked off. Soldiers fired blindly into the backs of their own men. The road became a slaughterhouse. General Braddock was shot off his horse, mortally wounded. The army was leaderless. The rout began. And in the middle of this hell, George Washington woke up while the professional British officers were paralyzed by fear. The failed Virginian planter took command. He didn't hide. He rode a white horse, a beacon for every enemy marksman, back and forth across the shattering lines. He beat men with his sword to stop them from running. He organized a rear guard. He loaded cannons. The air around him buzzed with death. A musket ball tore through his hat. Another grazed his neck. One horse was shot out from under him. He grabbed another. That horse was killed too. When the smoke finally cleared and the remnants of the British Army had limped away, Washington took off his coat. He found 4 bullet holes tearing through the fabric. 4 bullets, and not a scratch on his skin. The Native American warriors who fought that day later told stories of the tall warrior on the white horse. They said they aimed at him again and again. They said their rifles never missed, yet he would not fall. They whispered that the Great Spirit protected him, that he could not be killed in battle. Washington returned to Virginia a hero, but he also returned with a bitter lesson burned into his soul. He had seen the mighty British Army, the symbol of order and power, panic and run like frightened children. He realized they were not gods. They were men, and they could be beaten. But more importantly, he felt the sting of betrayal. Despite his heroism at the Monongahela, the British command still refused to give him a regular commission in the Royal Army. They patted him on the head, thanked him for his colonial service, and sent him home. They looked down on him. To them, he would never be a true Englishman. He would always be a second-class subject. Washington swallowed the insult. He hung up his sword. He married a wealthy widow named Martha Custis and dedicated himself to farming at Mount Vernon. He became a businessman, growing wheat and selling flour. For 15 years, the giant slept. But deep down, the resentment simmered. The young man who had once desperately wanted to wear the red coat now began to look at it with suspicion. The fire that had started in the wilderness had not gone out. It had just gone underground, waiting for the wind to change. And in 1775, the wind changed.